The next morning, Ethan left the house before sunrise, long before anyone expected. The roads were nearly empty, which was perfect because movement felt better than sitting still, always had. Ethan grabbed coffee, made two phone calls, answered emails, checked numbers while reviewing notes. Anything to keep moving. By 8 o'clock, he'd already done more than most people would do before lunch. Normally, that would have felt productive. But this morning, it felt different because every stretch of quiet seemed to open a door he couldn't quite close. The memory slipped in without warning, threading itself through every mile of empty road and every unfinished thought. Caleb's voice lingered there, steady and familiar. I saved you a piece. The words followed him like an echo, surfacing in the spaces between conversation and task, waiting whenever the noise faded. Ethan turned on the radio, louder than usual. A few minutes later, he turned it off. The silence returned. He called an investor buddy. The call lasted only 6 minutes, then silence again. He checked his phone. There was nothing important. The silence stayed, just sat there. For years, Ethan had mistaken movement for peace. As long as he was going somewhere, talking to someone, building something, he never had to sit long enough to hear himself think. But today, no matter how fast he moved, something kept catching up. The conference room overlooked half the city. Floor to ceiling windows, polished wooden table. For Ethan, rooms like this had always done something to him. They sharpened his thinking, pulled him into the game. Opportunities were easier to spot. People were already gathering when he arrived. Handshakes, introductions. Normally, by the time everyone had settled into their seats, Ethan would have become part of the room's gravity. Not through force, not even through value, just presence. A well timed joke would spark a laugh at one end of the table. His stories would pull a few people in. Then, thoughtful questions would shift the conversation in a new direction. And before long, attention would find its way back to him again and again. It had always happened naturally. Today, however, he felt like a spectator watching someone else's role. He took his seat, placed his notes carefully on the table, adjusted them once, then again, trying to quiet a restlessness he couldn't explain. The meeting began. Numbers unfolded across presentation slides, projections stretched years into the future, renovation estimates, expected returns. Each figure was familiar. He had studied them late into the night, reviewed every detail, walked in believing he knew the material as well as anyone in the room, probably better. Yet, as the discussion would wound through one topic after another, the information seemed to drift further away, like landmarks disappearing into fog. For a while, no one noticed. The conversation carried itself forward. Executives spoke, investors nodded, pages turned. Then, gradually, the current shifted. The discussion reached the point where Ethan was expected to step in. Ethan, what's your take? He hesitated. Only for a second, but it was enough. The room waited. Ethan cleared his throat. He started talking about NOI growth and cap rate compression, mentioned upside in the returns if occupancy stabilized, then drifted into something about repositioning the asset and improving the ROI through a hidden gem. He stopped, collected himself, finished the thought another way. It was complete. or should I say more incomplete. The conversation moved on. A few minutes later, another question came. Each time, Ethan found himself reaching for thoughts that usually came effortlessly. At each time, they felt just out of reach, like trying to remember a name sitting on the tip of your tongue. Across the table, Mark glanced at him, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Ethan caught it. The look people give when something feels slightly off. By the end of the meeting, the deal was still alive. Nobody challenged the proposal outright. No dramatic objections surfaced. No one slammed a folder shut or declared the numbers impossible. On the surface, everything remained intact. Yet Ethan could feel the difference in the spaces between words. The pauses lingered a little longer than they should have. Questions that might once have opened doors instead closed conversations. When he spoke, people listened politely, then turned elsewhere. The current that usually carried his ideas through the room seemed to break apart around him. By the final slide, the deal still had a future, but it no longer felt as though he was the one guiding it there. The momentum had attached itself to the spreadsheets, the projections, the process, everything except him. The meeting ended, yet none of them moved in his direction. No investor lingered to probe deeper into his strategy. No executive pulled him to the side to explore an angle he had raised. The room emptied with quiet efficiency, leaving behind only the faint sense that an opportunity had passed through his hands without even truly landing in them. Looking out the window, confused, for years he had blamed failure on a lack of opportunity. This wasn't that. The opportunity had been sitting right in front of him, and somehow he had shown up without fully being there. For a moment, he thought about the meeting. Then another thought slipped in. A small yet familiar voice. I saved you a piece. The words settled into the silence, like something finding him. Ethan wondered whether the absence he had felt in the room had started long before the meeting, or whether some part of him had been quietly slipping away ever since he had first heard that voice. He kept staring at the glass, waiting for the feeling to pass. It didn't. Instead, the voice seemed to linger just beyond reach, familiar enough to trust and strange enough to fear. And Ethan could no longer tell whether he was remembering it or listening to it now. The next afternoon, Sarah found herself standing in the kitchen staring at her phone. The message had been sitting there for 20 minutes, long enough to think about it far more than she should have. Her best friend, not an acquaintance, not a coworker, her best friend. The request itself wasn't unreasonable. It rarely was. Could you help me with something after work? Normally, Sarah would have answered immediately. Of course, no problem, happy to help. The words came so naturally, she sometimes typed them before she even finished reading the message. Today, she stared at the screen, then typed something different. I'm sorry, I can't tonight. Her thumb hovered over the send button. A tightness crept through her chest. Guilt was eating her alive. Saying no felt like betraying the person she had always been. Finally, she pressed send. Sarah immediately hated it. It wasn't wrong, just felt wrong. For several minutes, nothing. Sarah waited. Then the reply arrived. Oh. The words sat there, alone on the screen, small, simple, cold. Sarah frowned. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Never mind. I'll figure it out. The conversation ended there. No smiley faces, no heart, no joke, nothing. Just silence. Sarah stared at the phone, certain another message would follow. It didn't. The feeling stayed with her. That evening, she found herself scrolling through old messages. Years of conversations and memories. She'd been friends with her since the first day of grade school. Birthday reminders, last minute favors, more help, more advice, more solutions. Sarah kept scrolling slowly. Something started bothering her. Most of the conversations seemed to begin the same way: questions, requests, problems, and needs. She scrolled farther, looking for something else: a check in, a random hello, a conversation that existed simply because someone wanted to talk to her, not because they wanted something from her. The farther she looked, the harder those moments became to find. Sarah sat back confused. She wasn't angry. There was no tally being kept, no quiet ledger of favors and debts, no search for proof. If anything, she was searching for something that would undo the doubt, something that would tell her she was wrong, and somehow that was becoming harder to do. Without warning, a memory surfaced: a little girl sitting on a swing, legs kicking slowly through the air, watching other children form a group without her, wondering where she belonged and what she needed to do to become somebody people chose. The memory disappeared as quickly as it arrived, but the feeling remained. The same feeling, just older now. Sarah looked down at the phone resting in her hand. The question hit her like a quiet sneer she couldn't quite place, sharp, unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. Even worse, she couldn't find a single person she could safely deny it about. Did they love me, or did they love what I did for them? Tom's question followed Michael everywhere: through the parking lot, dinner, and the ride home. Even now, 3 days later, it was still there. Who convinced you being wrong was worse than saying nothing? Michael had believed the answer should have been obvious. A parent, teacher, bully, somebody. Instead, every time he tried tracing the feeling back, the trail disappeared. Friday afternoon found him sitting alone in his office. The building had mostly emptied, weekend energy already floating through the air. Silence left room for thinking, and lately, thinking had become dangerous for Michael. He rubbed his eyes, looked down at the spreadsheet in front of him, then froze. A sound drifted down the hallway: laughter. A group of employees talking near the break room. One voice louder than the others. Another burst of laughter followed. And suddenly, Michael wasn't 32 anymore. He was 8. The memory arrived without permission. His classroom. Construction paper was on the walls, colorful, beautiful. The teacher standing near the chalkboard. 20 kids, one question. Michael knew the answer. He remembered that much. His hand had gone up immediately, certain. The teacher smiled, called on him. Michael answered. Then laughter from only a few kids. But a few was enough. Heat rushed into his face. The teacher corrected him. Move on. The lesson continued. Nobody thought about it again. But Michael did. The memory flickered. Then another detail appeared. Something he hadn't remembered in years. The answer he gave wasn't wrong. Michael sat up right. The office disappeared around him. His pulse quickened. The memory felt different. He remembered going home, pulling out a book, checking and rechecking again, then checking again. The answer had been right. Right enough, anyway. Michael stared across the empty office, confused, because the memory he'd carried for decades wasn't, "I spoke up and was wrong." It was something else, stranger, and harder to understand. The laughter had come first, the facts came later, and somehow the feeling stayed longer than the truth. For a long moment, Michael sat motionless. Then another question entered the room, dangerously quiet. What if Tom's question had never been about being wrong at all, but about the moment but about the moment he learned it was safer to stay silent than to risk being heard? He pushed the thought away. It made too much sense to ignore, though. And if it was true, then this hadn't started at work. It hadn't started with Daniel. It hadn't even started with Tom's question. It had been following him for most of his life. Michael shut his laptop, and at last, he wasn't afraid of speaking. He was afraid of what he might remember next.